The life of a warship usually ends in deep water or in the roaring furnaces of a commercial scrapyard. For the United States ship Cory, the end began with an irreversible administrative execution. She was a Clemson-class destroyer stripped of her offensive machinery and deliberately mutilated to satisfy international treaty quotas. This partial dismantling left her a fractured steel shell, entirely vulnerable to total structural failure. The ship was not destroyed in combat. She was killed on paper and left to rot in the mud. The year was 1930. The United States Navy faced massive fleet downsizing driven by treaty limitations. Warships built during the vast construction surge of the previous decade were abruptly reclassified as excess tonnage. The Cory belonged to a wider group of flush-deck destroyers whose machinery had become increasingly difficult to justify. Many Bethlehem-built four-stackers carried Yarrow boilers, and those boilers were notorious for wearing out quickly in peacetime service. For Cory, the surviving official record does not isolate one failed boiler room as the single cause of disposal. It points instead to the larger collision of treaty limits, aging machinery, and the economics of keeping old destroyers alive. The Navy did not need the old destroyer badly enough to spend scarce money keeping her in the line. And under the treaty arithmetic of the early 1930s, that calculation ended her service. The ship was officially decommissioned and towed to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard for disposal. The industrial process of stripping a warship is a methodical deconstruction. At Mare Island, the Cory was partially dismantled rather than preserved as a fighting ship. Valuable fittings, weapons, and accessible metal were stripped away, and much of the above-deck structure disappeared. What remained was most of the hull and only a small portion of the superstructure with watertight integrity permanently compromised. Bulkheads, decks, plating, framing, and subdivision had been cut open, exposed, or left unsupported, so the hull no longer behaved like the fast, integrated girder it had been designed to be. Then the scrapping operation abruptly stopped. The exact institutional reason for halting the demolition remains undocumented, but the physical outcome is a matter of geographical record. What can be stated with confidence is narrower and stranger. After partial dismantling at Mare Island, the remains of ex-USS Cory were sold, taken a short distance up the Napa River, and eventually abandoned there. Later descriptions treat the stranded hulk as a kind of crude riverbank reinforcement, but the official record does not document a formal Navy breakwater project. The move carried the gutted destroyer away from Mare Island's industrial dry docks and into shallow water roughly a mile from the yard, where the stripped hulk settled into the mud and water of the river margin. The grounding fundamentally altered the physical state of the ship. She was no longer moving through the water was now moving through her. The intentional beaching fixed the damaged hull in a permanent stationary orientation against the continuous flow of the river. The deep artificial voids left by the shipyard crews immediately flooded with river water. The open engineering compartments filled with silt. The Cory had been successfully converted from a naval asset into a permanent geographic barrier. The disposal phase ended there. Yet the heavy steel framework still existed above the waterline. The ship was trapped in a highly unstable transition phase. Her remaining steel was now exposed to a completely different type of threat. The stripped hulk sat silently in the Napa River mudflats, raising the immediate question of how quickly an unmaintained, severely compromised steel shell from the previous decade would yield to complete structural collapse. The clock on a shipwreck does not stop when it hits the mud. For nearly a century, the stranded vessel has been locked in an aggressive cycle of environmental destruction. The Napa River presents a highly specific chemical and mechanical hazard, turning the site into a hostile place for exposed steel. The hull rests in a brackish intertidal zone where freshwater runoff meets tides pushing inland from the bay. This fluctuating salinity creates a corrosive environment for early 20th century naval steel. Unlike deep ocean wrecks sheltered by darkness, depth, and more stable conditions, an intertidal wreck is exposed again and again to water, oxygen, sunlight, mud, and air. The site, therefore, offers a vivid, long-duration example of metallurgical failure, showing how a steel warship can be consumed when trapped between two fluid states. With each tide, immersion, and exposure strip away protective rust layers, expose fresh metal, and drive severe internal corrosion and mass loss across the structure. Biological factors multiply the damage. Thick layers of green algae cling to the waterline. The organic growth traps moisture against the hull during low tide, ensuring the chemical breakdown never pauses. Through observing this exact process, surveyors established the precise environmental failure rate limits of intertidal naval steel. They proved exactly how long a thin-plated warship can endure before the environmental load completely exceeds the load-bearing capacity of the original design. A destroyer is fundamentally a sprint vessel. To achieve high operational speeds, naval architects minimized weight in every possible area. The shell plating on a ship of this class was exceptionally thin, right off the construction slipway, carrying no heavy armor belt to absorb environmental punishment. When subjected to 85 to 90 years of aggressive estuarine corrosion, the structural margin for error evaporates completely. Thermal cycling can add another layer of mechanical stress. The exposed steel heats under the afternoon sun, then cools as water returns across the flats. Over time, that expansion and contraction can aggravate already weakened joints, seams, and riveted connections, especially where corrosion has already thinned the metal. Furthermore, the continuous river flow pushes against the fixed hull, creating severe dynamic mechanical stress. The moving water acts as a hydraulic wedge, forcing its way into tiny cracks and expanding them. The constant pressure causes the heavily oxidized hull plates to visibly split apart, turning solid bulkheads into fragile, porous cages. This degradation turns the wreck into a hard physical boundary. Surfaces visible from shore may be unsupported, corroded through from below, and incapable of carrying a human load. Boarding would risk punching through rusted plating into jagged steel, mud, and flooded compartments. There is no reliable deck, anchor point, or stable route for internal inspection. The environment has completely sealed the site away from direct human contact. Because engineers could not walk the deck, the evidence had to come from distance. In Cory's case, the strongest public record is a small sequence of historic photographs rather than a formal photogrammetry program. The critical visual baseline began in the late 1930s when Jack Howland photographed the partially dismantled hulk in the Napa River. Those images fixed the identity, location, and general condition of the wreck in the first decade after disposal. They show the remaining hull, exposed internal spaces, and the kind of structural mutilation that later photographs could be compared against. From that initial visual anchor, successive generations of surveyors returned to the site to execute remote condition assessments. To maintain data consistency, they matched the exact geographical coordinates and viewing angles of the 1939 baseline. Observers stood on the adjacent shorelines with telephoto lenses or launched aerial platforms high overhead. By perfectly aligning the angles of the modern images with the original baseline photographs, they created a highly reliable tracking matrix. They systematically mapped the disappearance of specific deck sections, the gradual widening of open structural gaps, and the severe sagging of longitudinal beams. They tracked minute condition changes across multiple decades without ever requiring a physical presence on the rotting hull. The mechanics of this remote mapping are highly disciplined. Observers zoom in on specific structural nodes, analyzing shifting rivet lines and the altering angles of vertical stanchions. By comparing the distance between fixed reference points over successive 20 or 30-year intervals, analysts calculate the exact rate of structural yield. The shifting geometry captured in photographic emulsion or digital sensors records how the steel is contorting under its own weight while preserving a usable map of the ongoing decay. However, external visual mapping enforces a hard-proof sealing at the waterline and riverbed. Surveyors can document exposed decks, side plates, and visible collapse with precision, but the hull buried in estuarine sediment remains unobservable. Optical sensors cannot prove whether the keel is intact or fractured beneath the mud. Even so, the longitudinal photographic record is strong enough to shift the question from how the site was mapped to what the surviving external geometry reveals about the endurance of the remaining steel. To the naked eye, the surviving shell creates a compelling illusion. The flush deck design, defined by a single continuous shear line from bow to stern, reinforces this visual deception. The coherent silhouette of a classic four-stacker destroyer still projects sharply above the river, preserving the unmistakable geometry of early 20th century naval design. Yet this recognizable shape is structurally deceptive, standing only as a brittle facade wrapped around a dead core. The wreck is often described by naval history enthusiasts as one of the most striking visible remnants of a World War I-era four-stacker destroyer. Its port side still carries a long hydrodynamic profile against the current, and the aft end preserves enough of the angular stern and traditional fantail to remain legible to naval historians. This surviving external shell offers a critical engineering lesson regarding the resilience of early shear plating. The vertical side strakes of the outer hull were originally engineered to endure immense longitudinal stress from deep ocean swells and high-speed maneuvers. Even completely stripped of ongoing maintenance, this continuous outer cage of riveted steel has proven highly resistant to total outward buckling. The visual evidence confirms that the vertical side plates function as an independent perimeter wall. They hold the overall historical footprint together long after the internal transverse supports have entirely rusted through. The outer cage is surviving on its own inherent geometric stiffness, acting like an empty box that refuses to lose its outward shape. Careful visual comparison narrows that lesson for this individual hulk. Exposed deck structures and some internal supports have deteriorated faster than portions of the side shell. Horizontal surfaces trap rainwater, mud, and debris, while the side plating can still read as a continuous outline after the interior loses much of its usable structural meaning. That same shell also sets the next proof limit. The upper edges define the destroyer's historical perimeter, but the lowest visible strakes disappear into estuarine sediment, trapped silt, and marsh vegetation packed against the rusted steel. Surveyors cannot verify the lower transition joints, the keel, or whether the side walls still rest on original steel rather than compacted riverbed. The outline survives. The mechanism of failure must be read through the internal spaces and the massive pieces missing from the wreck's center. The heaviest structural damage visible on the shipwreck was not inflicted by decades of estuarine river exposure, but by the deliberate torches of shipyard crews long before the hull was permanently abandoned. The visual contradiction is immediate. The natural deterioration of the steel is entirely secondary to the massive artificial wounds inflicted during the initial dismantling process. In this specific case, the true debris field is defined not by a wide scatter of separated parts spread across the adjacent riverbed, but by the absolute physical absence of massive internal components and the isolated wreckage left scattered within the flooded compartments. The site requires surveyors to analyze what is missing just as much as what remains. The most critical forensic feature of the entire site is the series of deep structural voids left by the extracted heavy machinery. The extracted machinery, fittings, and accessible metal left open spaces, interrupted decks, and removed local foundations that had once helped distribute loads around the engineering areas. The machinery itself was not the ship's backbone, but the cutouts disrupted the hull girder's continuity and left the surrounding structure unsupported. These artificial openings created weak zones that influenced every later collapse pattern. By mapping these artificial cavities, analysts established a highly specific progression of structural failure. The analysis proves conclusively that the most severe mechanical collapse does not begin at the exterior extremities of the wreck, but progresses directly outward from the jagged edges of the artificial voids. The unsupported bulkheads immediately surrounding the empty boiler rooms completely lack the transverse cross-bracing required to resist shifting tidal pressure. Consequently, the internal steel framing constantly folds inward toward the empty center. The empty boiler rooms effectively act as sinkholes of structural tension, gradually pulling the remaining adjacent framework down into the flooded lower decks long before the solid outer extremities of the ship succumb to the elements. Beyond the massive empty spaces, the surviving photographs show that parts of the interior remained exposed inside the partially dismantled hulk. The camera looks into spaces that had once belonged to a working destroyer, amidships fittings, berthing areas, and rooms aft of the forward spaces. Those views are valuable because they confirm that the wreck was not a clean shell, but a damaged structure with internal remains still visible. The gradual disintegration and shifting positions of these unattached components document high tide surge paths through the open structural wounds, turning interior destruction into visible evidence. However, understanding the complete damage pattern is limited by the most obvious missing structure forward. The forecastle and forward portions of the hull had been removed or heavily cut down before the hulk reached its final state. That absence blocks any confident reconstruction of how the full length of the destroyer would have carried load across the uneven estuarine riverbed. Instead of a complete ship girder, the surviving evidence shows an interrupted hull, with the forward run of structure broken before it can tell the whole story. With the forward structure missing and the central cavities dictating the collapse path, the narrative moves from forensic mapping to site management. The final phase of any prolonged observation operation forces a sharp administrative choice upon the governing authorities. Planners are presented with a distinct trade-off knife. They must choose between authorizing a highly hazardous, intrusive intervention to recover rapidly dissolving scraps of steel, or enforcing strict, disciplined observation as the decaying structure simply vanishes into the earth. The latter choice represents a deliberate operational restraint, accepting that the object of study is ultimately doomed. The historic ship will not be saved, it will only be watched. The present management condition of the site is more uncertain than dramatic language allows. The Navy's own history states that Cory was stripped and sold for salvage on October 18, 1930, after decommissioning under the London Treaty. Public sources therefore do not support a simple claim that the United States Navy still holds absolute sovereign ownership of the remains. What can be said safely is that the hulk is extremely deteriorated, historically significant, and physically dangerous. Any intrusive work would require the correct legal authority, environmental review, site access permissions, and a serious safety case before anyone could justify touching the wreck. Because no public source confirms an official permanent watch list or a zero intervention policy, the practical conclusion is narrower. Cory is best understood through non-intrusive documentation, historic photographic comparison, and observation from outside the unstable structure. This final phase yields a narrower, more defensible legacy. Cory's hulk shows how an abandoned steel warship can be absorbed by an estuarine landscape, as corrosion, sediment, vegetation, tide, and time erase the clean lines of naval architecture. But the record is not a complete mathematical history. It is a fragmentary visual history, official ship data, a small body of late 1930s and 1960s photographs, and the surviving silhouette in the river mud. Its remaining steel will keep weakening, but the available record still preserves a rare view of a destroyer's slow transformation from naval machine into river debris.